Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Good evening, Wheaton College friends, families, and attendees. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight to hear our keynote speaker, Dr. Beth Allison Barr, the James Vardaman Professor of History at Baylor University. My name is Karen Lee, and I serve as your provost. It's my pleasure and privilege now to open with a word of prayer. This is a special prayer poem of love, blessing, power, and grace, adapted from the words of the medieval anchoress Julian of Norwich. In you, God the Creator, original parent, giver of life, we have our preservation and our bliss. In you, Christ, we have our restoring and our saving. In you, the Holy Spirit, is marvelous and plenteous grace. You are our clothing, for you wrap us and embrace us. You are our maker, our lover, our keeper. Teach us to believe that by your grace, all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. Amen.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Welcome to our lecture and to our symposium. My name is George Kalantzis. I teach theology, and I direct the Wheaton Center for Early Christian Studies. Before I introduce the person who's going to introduce the speaker, would you take your phone out? Take it out, look at it, and make sure that it is off. After the talk, Dr. Barr has agreed to a Q&A. We have microphones on the sides, and we invite you to come to that with your questions. Outside, there is a book table, and if you are kind, she may even sign it for you. I'm imposing things. I haven't asked you about it. So. It has been a wonderful couple of hours, a whole day actually, on a two-day discussion that we put together with the Visual Museum of Women in History and the Center for Women in Leadership. And we invite you to come and join us tomorrow for a second day of that. Dr. Lynn Kohik is the Distinguished Professor of New Testament and Director of Houston Theological Seminary at Houston Christian University. But that's current history. She has been a Distinguished Professor of New Testament here at Wheaton College for almost 20 years. She's our friend. She is an internationally known and wonderful New Testament scholar. And I invite Dr. Kohik to come and introduce our speaker.
Well, it is my absolute honor to introduce our speaker, and I also will say it is wonderful to be back here at Wheaton and discuss things related to women in the history of Christianity. And tonight, we are in for a treat. Dr. Beth Allison Barr is the James Vardaman Endowed Professor of History at Baylor University in Waco, Texas, which is just around the corner from Houston, in Texas miles, which are very different than Illinois miles. Dr. Barr received her PhD from the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. She looked, there you go. She looked at pastoral care of women by examining 14th and 15th century English sermons. And it's a really good dissertation. Like, I had so much fun reading it, and then we talked about it on a podcast, and And yeah, so you can listen in to our fun conversation. But tonight, she's going to continue in that vein, talking about it is time to rewrite history. Now, Dr. Barr is perhaps not as well known, although she should be very well known for her dissertation work, but she's actually perhaps better known to many of you through her book, The Making of Biblical Womanhood, which is, as we chatted about this, it just grew out of the classes that she teaches there at Baylor University. And so she thought, why not? I'll put it in a book. And then it just exploded, and her life has not been the same, most for the better. We are certainly, it has bettered our lives. And if you haven't read The Making of Biblical Womanhood, I really encourage you to do so. Her most recent book that just came out a few weeks ago, Becoming the Pastor's Wife. If you didn't think it could get better, Making of Biblical Womanhood, well, I don't know. Maybe it has. The second book is just also absolutely fantastic, and that will be available for you after this talk. But we'd love to welcome you now, Dr. Barr, and your essay, It is Time to Rewrite History. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming here. I did not ever attend Wheaton. It's been many years since I was here, but my sister is an alum of Wheaton, and so I used to come and spend breaks from graduate school with her on the campus here. So I am familiar with Wheaton, although I was a whole lot younger last time I was here. So I wanted to start off with a story that happened recently. And for those of you who know, my husband is a Baptist pastor in Texas. Texas Baptists are weird. Like everything about Texas. It is its own Baptist, really, affiliation. And some people who are associated with Texas Baptists are Southern Baptists, and some people are not. And some people are Cooperative Baptist, and some people are just BGCT or Texas Baptist. Okay, this always confuses people because they think I'm still SBC, and I'm like, no, I'm Texas Baptist. So it's a different thing. And the BGCT, Texas Baptists, have been ordaining women for a long time. One of the things that I really liked about Texas Baptists, and despite other, issues that they may have, I was always very encouraged because they have been ordaining women for so long, and they support women in ministry, and they have a seminary. The seminary at Baylor, Truett, is one of the few Baptist seminaries that does fully support women in ministry. So last October, the BGCT annual meeting was held in Waco. And I at first wasn't going to go, but people kept emailing me and said, Beth, you need to go. They're having a panel on women's ordination. And I was like, why? They already ordain women. Why are they doing this? But people just kept emailing me. And then I found out that a friend of mine was going to be on it. And I texted him and I was like, what's this panel about? And he was like, I don't know. He was like, they just asked me to be on it. And I said, yes. And I said, do you know, I said, it's on women in ministry. Why did they ask you? And he was like, I honestly don't know. And I was like, okay. So that's fine. So I decided to go, mostly because I was very curious what this panel was going to be about. And also when I got there, it turned out really fun because I met Linda Barnes Popham, which I don't know if y'all know who she is, but she is one of the Baptist churches that got kicked out of the Southern Baptist Convention in 2023. She was a Southern Baptist pastor of a church in Louisville, Kentucky for 35 years in the back yard of Al Mohler, and nobody bothered her until 2023 when they kicked her out. So she was at the BGCT, which was a lot of fun. So I met her right before I went into the panel session, and I was really excited because I was like, oh my gosh, this is fun. I got to talk to Linda Barnes Popham. This is great. And I went into the panel session and sat down and realized that this indeed was a strange panel on women in ministry, because it was all men, except for one woman who they put in the middle of the men. There were five men and one woman. So they had 3 on one side and 2 on the other side of her. And the moderator got up and said, this is going to be a conversation where I have moderated questions. People are just going to answer the questions. They're not going to talk to each other. They're just going to answer the questions about where their stance is on women in ministry. And I'm starting to get really uncomfortable by this point, because I'm like, wait, this is like settled science in the BGCT, right? We've been ordaining. Why are we having a panel talking about the pros and cons of ordaining women with a female senior pastor sitting up on stage in the middle? And I'm not going to get into everything that happened, but it was even more awful than I began to suspect. Because essentially what it was some of the people up there supported women in ministry, like my friend, but some of them did not. And one of them was a very avid, outspoken complementarian who essentially turned and looked directly at this female senior pastor while he was speaking and telling her that he did not think that women were called by God and that it was sinful. And I mean, it was at that point that I was just, my brain was just exploding at that point. I will tell you something sort of funny is I found out later when the Baptist Standard published the article about how good this panel was. There's 500 people in the room, y'all. Well, 300 people in the room, not 500. Felt like 500. 300 people in the room. Guess whose face is on the front page? Looking like as if sort of, acknowledging that yes, it was me. They put me on there, which just made it even worse. And it was actually the one time I was smiling, and it was because I was laughing because I just couldn't believe it. I was just like, this is so ridiculous, and that's what they put on that front page. But as I sat there and listened to this travesty of putting, I argue that it is extremely traumatic to women who are called to ministry and in ministry, and then to put them in the spotlight on stage with people who don't think they belong there. That is not something we should ever do again. So as I was watching this travesty, one of the things that I was thinking, I was like, these people don't know their Baptist history. And in fact, because I was writing this book, Becoming the Pastor's Wife, I knew on the tip of my fingers that in 1972, a woman named Drusilla Fordham, who was a black woman, was the first senior pastor of a Southern Baptist church. Did y'all know that? Drusilla Fordham. And the reason I knew that is because the Home Mission Board, the Southern Baptist Home Mission Board magazine that they put out to everyone all the time. I remember it growing up in my Southern Baptist church, and you would see this magazine, laying around, and people could pick it up and take it home or whatever. And they ran an article on Drusilla Fordham talking about all of the good things she was doing and what a good pastor she was. And the title of the article, it said Drusilla Fordham, and underneath it, it said pastor. And yet, here we were in 2024 that long after women had been serving in senior pastor roles in Southern Baptist churches, having an argument on stage about whether women could actually do that. The title of the symposium has been Believe Her Story. And that's actually a really apt way to describe what was happening to that senior pastor as she sat there on that stage. And I mean, kudos to her. She pulled it out. She burst into tears afterwards when she got off the stage because every female pastor in the room was actually crying. We had to sit down and have a little circle up. But those pastors sitting on that panel with her, who were still staunchly complementarian, did not believe her. They did not believe that God called her, just like God has always called women. And I think that it's not the whole reason, but I think part of the reason that people don't believe that God calls women too is because of the way evangelicals have been teaching church history. We have been teaching it in a way that not only erases the existence of women, but recasts women who were leaders, and nobody can argue that they weren't leaders, but our history recasts them in ways that diminishes their leadership. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight, y'all. I have a few examples for you. The first one that I want to start off with, we'll move from a very serious thing to something that I think you're going to find a little bit more light. And that is something that happened in June 1965. My new book is titled Becoming the Pastor's Wife. The subtitle is how marriage became women's path to ordination, how marriage replaced, I can't remember my own subtitle. So how marriage replaced ordination as a woman's path to ministry. That's it. So this book, while it is about the pastor's wife, it is also about the story of women's ordination. It's the history of women's ordination and how it meets the role of the pastor's wife, okay? So in 1965, the 10th Annual Conference of Ministers' Wives, an auxiliary to the Southern Baptist Pastors Conference, met at Park Cities Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas. Is that your church? Somewhere? Oh, okay. The theme of the conference was The Minister's Wife, Best of All Possible Lives? ? At the bottom of the program was 2 lines from the 1879 Norwegian play, The Dollhouse. The first line that there was spoken by Helmer, a male character, who reminds his wife Nora that, quote, before all else, you are a wife and mother. Nora responds, and this is on the program, that I no longer believe. I believe that before all else, I am a human being, just as much as you are. Just want to let that sink in for y'all. In 1965, a meeting of Southern Baptist pastors' wives held their annual conference on a theme questioning the quality of life for pastors' wives. The quote they included in the printed program was a quote from a play that focuses on gender inequity and the importance of women not just being dolls in their husband's home. As one summary of the play states, quote, the young wife and mother Nora initiates a door slam heard round the world that still echoes today. If this isn't surprising enough, the conference also hosted a debate among the pastor's wife over the theme, is it the best life? As one of the attendees wrote, it was a very clever program. Everyone got involved. And then, would you believe, she continued, that the debate was won by the negative? To put it bluntly, in 1965, SBC pastors' wives recognized gender inequity. They encouraged women to see their identity as more than a wife and mom. And they concluded that being a pastor's wife was not the best of all possible lives. And the way that they did this is different people spoke in the debate, and then everyone in the room voted. Okay? So this is like a community response, that the pastor's wife life has problems. They had misgivings about their role. They questioned if it was a calling. And they had concerns about gender inequity in their home and places of work. 12 years later, one of the women who was in attendance at this conference was a woman named Minette Drumright. And she later actually became a recipient of the SBC Minister's Wife of the Year Award, which I talk about a lot in my book, which is a really fun thing. But she also wrote, in 1977, it was published in 1978, she wrote a curriculum for the Southern Baptist Convention Seminary Extension course. And this is the way, this is sort of like, this was a way that people could get seminary degrees without having to be residential. Okay, this is before we had online and Zoom and stuff like that. You had the seminary extension courses. The title of the seminary extension course was Women in the Church, a college-level curriculum series. In it, Drumright made an argument for women's ordination. She's a pastor's wife. As she explained in the introduction, quote, "I do not recall ever having been taught the concept, but somehow I grew up with the idea that women were on a lesser level than men. Somehow women had a secondary status and role. Men's time was more valuable than women's. Men's judgment was sounder than women's. Women's primary task in life was to please men. Women should take all the responsibility for keeping things smooth and accept the blame when they went wrong." I won't ask you to raise your hands. She continued that after a study of scripture and history, she realized what she had been taught about women was wrong. She realized that women's subjugation in the church was a consequence of sin, and that God's dream for humanity, to steal Sarah Bessey's words, had always been, quote, "unity and partnership between men and women as they accomplished God's purposes together," end quote. Y'all, I've been reading in the Southern Baptist Convention archives for a few years now. Even I was caught by surprise about the magnitude of difference between SBC attitudes in the 1960s and 70s towards women and what it has become today. And this shift has happened in my lifetime. Can you imagine how different North American evangelicalism might be right now if Drumright's story about the history of women in the Southern Baptist Convention had been believed? If the conviction of pastors' wives in 1965 that women should be regarded as human first, and that their role was not the highest calling for women, if people had listened to them? Part of the reason the church was able to build a theology of subjugation in one of the most rigid forms in Western church history is because we don't know our own history. For those of you who don't know, my most recent book, Becoming the Pastor's Wife, and I wrote my subtitle so I wouldn't forget it here. Anyway, connects the dots between the decline of female ordination and the rise of the role of pastor's wife, tracing its patterns in the larger history, ancient, medieval, Reformation, and modern of Western Christian women's leadership. It thus continues the work of the making of biblical womanhood, although in a different and more targeted way, arguing specifically that the rise of complementarian theology has been enabled through the narrative evangelicals tell about not just women in the church, but specifically what became the pastor's wife role. And not only ignoring women's history, which is a problem, but recasting it in ways that diminishes what women were actually doing. So what I want to do for the next few minutes is give you two examples of this, okay? One, medieval, because I'm a medievalist, and one a bit more modern, okay? So I have to look. There we are. Last January, literally right before I had the surgery that put me in this, I went to a place that I had been waiting years to see. It is in the far northeast of England on the very edge of the sea. It is a town called Whitby. Some of you may have heard of it, especially if you are familiar with Bram Stoker. Probably you weren't expecting that, because it is here in the last decade of the 19th century that Stoker recast the Russian ship Dmitri of Novara that wrecked on the beach you see right up there in 1885 as the Demeter of Varna. He wasn't all that creative. The ill-fated cargo ship that brought Dracula to the shores of England. Okay, this is where Dracula enters England and into our lives. I got to stand on that beach amidst piles of driftwood. I didn't see Dracula, but I did see one of the oldest piers in Britain and walked out on it, possibly the oldest site of a pier still in use in the world, as its foundations date from 1190. I also climbed, the other picture behind me, the famous 199 steps from city center of Whitby to St. Mary's Church, way, way, way up on the precipice. Not quite as old as the pier, the steps date from the 14th century and were originally built from wood before they were replaced with stone. And if you climb those steps today, one of the things you will notice as you climb is that there are these weird benches placed along the path on the way up. And those benches are shaped like coffins. And this actually doesn't have to do with the Dracula story. It has to do with the fact that the parish church was at the top of the hill. And so when the people, for the funerals, the pallbearers had to carry that coffin up those 199 steps, up to the top. And so the benches were made to rest, literally that dead weight, as they carried it up. Sorry, I didn't mean to make that a joke. I was just... St. Mary's, absolutely magnificent view of this church, stands precariously on the edge of the cliff, overlooking Dracula's beach. It's been guarding the souls of the townfolk since perhaps the early Middle Ages. But Dracula, as fun as that is, and St. Mary's Church, as amazing as it was to see it, weren't the reasons I was there. I was there was because of a building that stood on the other side of St. Mary's Church, a ruin. You can see it a little bit peeking out behind that St. Mary's Church up on the cliff. I'm going to give you a better picture of it. And you can all admire my photography skills. Anyway, this is the remains of Whitby Abbey. I wish you could know what it felt like to stand on that cliff. The sea behind me, the cold wind that froze my cheeks and turned my lips blue, the 12th century remains of one of the most important monasteries in early medieval Britain towering in front of me. It's one of the most moving places I have been in a long time. Not just because of the grandeur, but because of what this site represents. You see, 1,500 years ago, a woman named Hild built this monastery. Not this one, this is the later ruins. The Vikings destroyed Hild's monastery. But a woman built the original monastic site here. She was of royal lineage related to the king of Northumbria, and she'd converted to Christianity as a teenager, baptized by St. Paulinus himself in the city of York, and possibly also consecrated, dare I say, ordained by him as well. Hild felt called to ministry at some time. She was out, took 19 years, but she eventually dedicated her life to serving God, which meant she became a nun. And then she became an abbess. And then in 657, she built her own monastery. And for those of you at the symposium this morning, we got a little brief view of this, that this was not just an ordinary monastery. This is what we call a double monastery, which means it has communities of both men and women inside of it. And one of the peculiar functions, at least we would consider it peculiar today, they considered it ordinary in the medieval world, okay? This is just weird to us. But women were always in charge of double monasteries, okay? And it's not like, as some later scholars have argued, that because they needed men to do the work. No, that's not why the women were in charge of these. What I know as a medieval historian is that Hild functioned as a woman in a clerical office that exercised religious authority over men and was considered one of the most authoritative offices at that time. Indeed, it was equivalent to being a bishop. I know Hild lived during a time when women were ordained more freely, and female leadership was not anomalous. A time when abbesses exercised pastoral and political authority over women and men, clergy and non-clergy. Abbesses were exceptional women with extraordinary power, argues Jennifer Edwards in her really fantastic book following a double monastery in France across several hundred years. Yet, Edwards continues, there were many of these types of women across Europe with access to similar resources and opportunities. Women like Hild were extraordinary, yet representative of broader patterns. Indeed, this is what I really like to do, y'all. When I was at Whitby, I came to it from London, where I had spent a few days reading medieval manuscripts, including this one that you see behind me, which is a 14th century manuscript in the British Library that was specifically compiled for a female monastic house. And what is really fascinating, in fact, if you can look up here, I don't think I have a pointer, but if you look, the one in front, you can see the Virgin Milburga right there next to the big letter, and over on the other side is actually to Hild. You can see Hild's name. If you can't see it, don't worry about it. But nonetheless. But what's really remarkable about this manuscript is that it is not only contains the lives of female leaders, and there's a whole lot of them, y'all. It not only contains the lives of female leaders, but it actually told their stories in a way that amplified their leadership. It's actually really quite remarkable. One of my favorite stories, for example, and I may tell this again tomorrow, I don't know. But one of my favorite stories, for example, is one of these women whose body was later moved from the place where she was a monastic in Wells. It was translated as their fancy word for kidnapping the saint's body and moving it to another location. And it was, her body was in Wells, her name is Winifred, and the English took her body and moved it to enhance the reputation of Shrewsbury Abbey. Do you know how this manuscript tells that story? It says that the body was only moved because Winifred decided that she wanted to go to England. and she gave the monks the idea. So instead of men kidnapping a female body and using it for their own purposes, they were actually following the will of a woman, okay? It's really quite remarkable. Y'all, patriarchy has always existed in church history. There is no golden age for women in ministry. Yet at the same time, the history of women always serving in ministry is there. The history of women always serving in leadership in churches is there. The history of women always serving in leadership positions that exercise pastoral authority and have authority over men is always there. Yet, guess how the evangelical world tells the stories of women like Hild? I'm going to give you an example from my favorite thing to complain about, but also because it's so important. And some of you might be recognizing this. It is an essay titled Women in the History of the Church, Learned and Holy but Not Pastors. Don't you love that? Okay. Written by a man named William Weinrich, who was at the time a professor of early church history and patristic studies at Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And it was published in a collection edited by Wayne Grudem and John Piper, titled Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, a Response to Evangelical Feminism. Now, this was published in 1992. This was a long time ago. The problem, though, is that this is the history we keep telling. And I can tell you this because when I read the negative reviews of my books, the way that they try to undermine what I am saying about women's leadership is by using these arguments, okay? So let me just give you, we can't do all of this, but I'm just going to give you, I don't know how much of this you can see out there, but essentially, this is actually specifically a page where he's talking about Hild or Hilda, okay? And one of the things, if you look over on the other side, he's talking about double monasteries. And at first it sounds like somewhat reasonable. He says, yeah, these women they could be officially recognized in these institutions. They held a lot of power. Medieval abbesses whose powers could approach those of a bishop. He actually says that. The double monasteries in the 7th and 8th century, although double monasteries continued until the 11th century, but nonetheless. But he said that the women in these had a lot of power. But then he says this. He says, yeah, but the reason, well, first of all, before that, I want you to listen to what he says about Hild. If you look up there, you can see it. He says, these women were noble abbesses, ruled their monasteries, they were builders of churches, had administrative wisdom, they attended royal councils and ecclesiastical synods. One may mention Abbess Hilda at the Council of Whitby in AD 664. Does anybody know enough history to know what's the problem with that? Y'all, Hild didn't just attend that council. It was her monastery. She was the officiating clergy. In fact, if you look at depictions of Hild, it shows her sitting in a seat. I should have had one. But it shows her sitting in a seat with the men standing around, and they're smaller. I just don't know how that turned into attended royal councils and ecclesiastical synods. And then he goes on there and he says, essentially, although nuns and monks shared common functions in the scriptoria, the schools, and perhaps the divine services, the early double monasteries were, as noted, extension of a ruling family's power, and as such governed by a member of the ruling family. So the abbess was essentially just a political royal figure here, sort of like a, I guess like the British kings and queens, etc., who are figureheads but have very little actual power. He also continues, this is my favorite part, this is at the very bottom. He says, moreover, nuns and monks lived separately and their work was divided, the nuns doing the less strenuous work. This shows me how little he knows about medieval history. Thinking about the work, even if he's thinking, although really the nuns actually didn't do the work, it was the lay brothers and sisters who did the work, both the men and the women. He also doesn't know that housework wasn't gendered female until the early modern period, and that's a tidbit you can find in Becoming the Pastor's Wife, okay? But nonetheless, I mean, women were often in charge of the men doing the work, but it didn't become gendered task for women until the early modern world. You can read Kit French's book, Good Households and Good Householders, on that. Did I go to the next one? No. Okay, there we are. So, anyway, and then he continues. I've skipped ahead to his conclusion. And it's just this remarkable conclusion. Because he did go through and say, look, here's these women doing these things. Yeah, there's a lot of women. He often casts them, couches, they're, what we just saw with Hild. But then he gets to the end, and this is what he says. He says, evidence shows, and it starts, that's evidence, shows that the Pauline statements against women speaking in the church were consistently upheld. Contrary practices were regarded as innovative and opposed to the truth and were by ecclesiastical discipline and censure excluded from the church. The practice of the early and medieval church was followed without question by the churches of the Reformation, both Reformed and Lutheran. He's Lutheran, by the way. That's why he put that in there. Both Reformed and Lutheran, and by virtually all other communions until the most recent past. Although they are favorable, he's talking about these authors, to women's egalitarian participation, he says even they say that when women did seek a position of prominence, they rarely evinced what he calls a feminist impulse, but rather were very hesitant to challenge the rightful leadership of men. That observation, as much as anything, testifies to the pervasive and universal faithfulness of the church to the biblical and apostolic word throughout its history. The utter paucity of instances adduced where women were given or took the function of public preaching and teaching confirms it. Oh my gosh, y'all, do you know how many medieval women were preaching? Anyway, that's another whole day. But nonetheless, did you see what he did there? And I descended into my Texas accent there but do you see what he's done? It's really clever. He's acknowledged the important role played by women in church history. He also quoted some reputable scholars in there too. But at the same time, he diminished it. Hild attended an ecclesiastical synod instead of recognition that she was one of the officiators of it. And then he concludes that because women serving in leadership roles are anomalous and were hesitant to challenge the rightful leadership of men, he states that the church speaks in one voice, as it always has throughout history, that women belong under male authority and that they know it. Do you know what I think? Doesn't matter because I'm going to tell you. Sorry. I think describing women as extraordinary is a subtle way of reinforcing patriarchy. If Deborah becoming a judge in the Hebrew Bible is understood as an exception due to extraordinary circumstances rather than something normative, then her appearance in that role doesn't threaten claims that the Bible supports male-only pastoral leadership. If women like Hild, women who exercised spiritual authority over men and held the highest ecclesiastical offices in the world, were just an exception, then their status doesn't threaten claims that Christian history speaks with one voice on male-only pastoral leadership. Categorizing women who exercise pastoral authority as exceptional maintains the fiction that women haven't been and never can be pastors. Do you have a better sense of how I felt standing on that cliff in front of Whitby Abbey? We live in a world where churches are moving backwards on women's roles. The BGCT was a clear example of that. Limiting women's calling, barring women from teaching and pastoral roles, even limiting classes they take in seminaries, and justifying it by saying that for 2,000 years the church always has interpreted Scripture as barring women from leadership positions. And they get away with it because we don't know our history. They get away with it because when we read things like this that says Hild attended that synod, we don't know enough to realize how wrong that perception is. Now, this is obviously frustrating to me as a medieval scholar, but I understand that medieval history is in the far distant past. It's not surprising that people get it wrong. What is astonishing, though, is how quickly modern church history has been rewritten in the same ways. So let's just jump very quickly ahead to the Southern Baptist Archives, okay? Oh, first of all, yeah, I meant to show you that, all of the women, scholarship on women in leadership positions. Let's jump ahead to the Southern Baptist Archives. Now, from the way the Southern Baptist Convention acts right now, it acts and it claims that the Southern Baptists have always been against women in pastoral positions, that the churches that have done this are sort of the renegades, and now we're finally corralling them in, right? We're making them either conform to what we've always done, or they have to leave. That's what we're doing, right? Except for, see these documents over there behind me? The cartoon is great. The cartoon is from 1986. On the other side, that paper, that newspaper article, Baptist End Pay Subsidies, you know what this is about? This is in this attempt to push women out of pastoral positions. The Southern Baptist Convention realized that the churches that had the most female pastors were actually missionary churches that were funded by the Home Mission Board. And so what they did is they cut subsidies to those small mission churches that had female pastors. I can't tell you how terrible that is, okay? Just this, I know we won't read all of it. This is look at the date, if you can see that, 1986, from a little church in Georgia that writes, because they just learned that there was a recent vote to give no future support to women serving as pastors, and we were horrified. Southern Baptist women have always been the major supporters of our mission work, and it is unthinkable that you would take an action like this. Surely, sirs, you have studied your Bible. I love that. And then it goes on, we hope you reconsider. Okay? Oh, I'm pointing at the wrong thing. Oops, I went the wrong way. Sorry, y'all. I'm inept. I'm a medievalist. Okay, there we are. Yeah. And I have this picture up here because for those of you who know that I have a podcast that I've done with the Bible for Normal People with Savannah Locke called All the Buried Women, that this document up here is one of them in the case in the second episode that's called The Invisible Woman. And it is about a woman named Sarah Wood Lee who was caught in the ordination crisis with Kathy Hoppe, who's the woman we interviewed for All the Buried Women. And these were two women who were church planters with their husbands, and they both felt called to ministry. And Kathy Hoppe was already ordained, and Sarah Wood Lee was planning to get ordained. And the Home Mission Board, first of all, revoked the money from Kathy Hoppe's family because she was ordained, even though they had already moved over 1,000 miles away to church plant in North Dakota. And she was 8 months pregnant with their first child, and the Southern Baptist Convention pulled their salary. Sarah Wood Lee wrote a letter back, which I'm so grateful for, because if you look down at the bottom of that, she's mad because they're mad about her ordination. They told her not to get ordained, or they said that she was going to be categorized not as part of the pastoral team, but as the home and family category, the home and church category. And she writes back to them, and she says, please categorize me as ministry team pastor or partner or something to that effect. If you can't, then don't categorize me as anything. I would tell you, for your information, that I too will be graduating with my husband in December with an MDiv degree. Following that weekend, I will be ordained to the gospel ministry. I choose to be a minister and not a minister's wife. 1980s, y'all. As recently as the 1980s, and I'm going to wrap this up, in one of the now most conservative denominations on women's roles, women were ordained as ministers to the gospel and even serving as senior pastors. Yet in 2023, the SBC messengers agreed with Al Mohler that for 2,000 years, the Bible has been interpreted to reject women's leadership, and that church history backs this up. And 13 million, well, not all of them, they weren't all there voting, but the people representing 13 million Baptists agreed with him. History matters. Knowing history matters. Also, knowing how history is recast to fit modern narratives matters. And one of the most surprising things that I found in this book is that my role as a pastor's wife played a part in the diminishing of women's ordination. Now, I'm not kicking on the pastor's wife role. What I'm kicking on is what conservative evangelicals have done to the pastor's wife role. The research for this book includes the analysis of 150 books written by and for pastors' wives. It isn't until the 1980s and 90s that the number of these books begin to increase significantly and that we begin to see language emphasizing male headship and female submission. What I found is that there is a measurable shift in what these pastors' wives' books teach about being a pastor's wife. And as we move closer to the 1990s and the year 2000, what we begin to see is that the call that being married to a pastor is the equivalent of being called to ministry, and that it is the highest calling for women in ministry, and that if you feel called to be in ministry, you are probably being called to marry a minister. Probably lots of women can relate to this. Y'all, pastors' wives do incredible things in churches. But their work in complementarian theology is always subject and secondary and dependent upon their husband's job. It's also unpaid labor. But nonetheless, women have always done leadership in the church. What has changed is not the work women do. What has changed is what we call the work women do. The medieval world called Milburga an abbess, a mitred bishop. The Southern Baptists called Sarah Wood Lee, a woman called to pastoral ministry, a minister's wife. If you've seen my book, you might have noticed the cover of it. And on the front cover, you see the 1950s pastor wife, right? Looks like a great book. But if you look behind her, you see a shadow. And I'm a Star Wars fan, so now you know where this came from. But you see a shadow of a medieval abbess, of a medieval saint. And do you know who that medieval saint is? It's Catherine of Alexandria. Catherine of Alexandria was the patron saint of the order of preachers in the medieval world. And I think I will end with that. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll give Dr. Barr just 20 seconds to catch her breath, and we invite you to come to either side with a question or a comment that you may have.
Always takes that first person.
That's right. Yes, you need.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Resources. There are so many. I mean, part of the problem, part of the work that I'm doing, and one of the reasons why I'm in this space, instead of just not writing about medieval sermons, is because there is a serious gap between what the academy knows and what the church knows. There is a serious gap between what pastors know and what academics know, and then what pastors teach to their congregations. And I've looked at a lot of church history textbooks. There's some. Justo Gonzalez is the best one out there that I've seen that's used broadly in seminaries. But even it, I'll say, it marginalizes women's history. Women are definitely more the minority, and they're sort of the after story, okay? It's like, we'll talk about all the men, and then, oh yeah, this is what women are doing. And when you portray women like that in textbooks, what you portray is that they are secondary, and that the main story is the story of men, okay? So even really good textbooks still fall to doing that somewhat. So honestly, what we need to do, as I said, the title of my talk, is we need to write us some new history books, specifically for the church, that tells the stories of women accurately in church history. Marian Taylor has begun to do some of this work. She has 2 volumes that essentially are just almost encyclopedias of women in the church doing the work from the patristic era all the way up through the modern era. She is a great resource. I think her books are relatively affordable. So that is definitely a good resource. There's also one of the best academic books talking about what women were really doing in the medieval world is by Gary Macy. It's a book that I use quite a lot in Becoming the Pastor's Wife. And it's called The Hidden History of Women's Ordination, of Medieval Women's Ordination. And it's published by Oxford Press, and is an excellent piece of scholarship. So those are a couple of places. I've put out resources before on my Substack about women, so I can do that again to try to help point towards places. But yeah, no, this is, the lack of our understanding of women in the church is really quite remarkable, and how history has been rewritten to reshape us.
I also grew up SBC in Texas, and so I knew some of those things. Was the same conversation happening in other denominations at the same time, or has it been like, oh, the SBC did it, and then a few years later another denomination did it, or was it all sort of at the same rate?
So let me answer that 2 ways quickly. First of all, the Southern Baptist Church is not the only actor. But the Southern Baptist Convention is at the center of this movement to push women out of ministry, okay? Part of this is because it's a monster. It is the 2nd largest denomination in the U.S. It's not technically a denomination, but for lack of a better word, affiliation of churches. And at its height, it had over 16 million people in it. Over 40,000 churches. It never actually joined the North American, the Evangelical, I always forget the name of it, North American Evangelical, Association. Because it was by itself, it didn't need them. But it often overlapped, a lot of the key figures overlapped. And so you can see in sort of the key turning points in moving towards complementarian theology, such as the Chicago Statement on Inerrancy in the 1970s, the big council that was held for that, as well as the creation of the Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, the writing of the Danvers Statement, which was published in Christianity Today, I think in 1987, and then moving towards the 2000 Baptist Faith and Message, which said that women should graciously submit to their husbands and not be pastors. And so what the Southern Baptist Church was doing, it wasn't alone in doing it, but it was definitely one of the main influencers, okay? But this general backlash towards women in ministry happened broadly in North America after the 60s and 70s, in which we begin to see women having for the first time more equal access to education, to credit, I tell my students that Barbie had a dream house before women could get mortgages in their own name on houses. And so all of these rapid changes are happening in the 60s and 70s, and more women are now going to college, are going to seminary. Not huge numbers, but enough, and they're going into the pastoral track. And what we begin to see is more and more denominations start ordaining women and supporting them. And then this is when we see this sort of conservative backlash that also begins to start decrying the slippery slope, that ordaining women is the slippery slope away from believing the Bible. And so this happens, but it all happens at the same time. Mm-hmm.
I really love this work on the idea of the minister's wife as an alternate title for women in ministry. And I'm curious what you uncovered in your research on other alternate titles. For example, when I was working as an associate pastor, I was called the discipleship director.
Yes.
So I'm curious what you came across in the archives and in your research, because I know many of my colleagues in this room are serving as pastors, but they're called administrators and
absolutely
directors, et cetera.
That's actually a big part of my argument in becoming the pastor's wife, is the labels we use to still benefit from the necessary work of women in the church without paying them the same as men and without giving them those titles of authority, okay? So we had an episode on, it's a 5-part miniseries, All the Buried Women, and our 3rd episode was called Loopholes, which is just exactly this, and we highlighted 3 of the biggest ones. And one of them is the pastor's wife. And I said, this is something that I realized myself, and in fact, there's research that I cite in the book that shows that churches who do not ordain women, when you ask the congregants how they feel about their church not supporting women in ministry, the response is, of course our church supports women in ministry. Look at the pastor's wife. Look at all the amazing things she does. And so the pastor's wife covers the absence of women in ministry. It's not really her fault, it's how the role was created and to do this. So this was a shift in how the role was created. So that's one of them, pastor's wife, we already said. Another one is missionaries and evangelism. Women often can do almost anything if they have the title of missionary, as long as they're not doing it in a white Southern Baptist church. One of the reasons why nobody knows Drusilla Fordham's name is because her church was a missionary church. It was a black church, and she was black. And I'm very sorry, but Southern Baptist history shows us that they were much less concerned about women teaching people of color than women teaching white people. And that, y'all, is called racism, pure and simple. And so this is one of the reasons why missionaries were able to do so many things. The 3rd loophole actually is something that is really fun, is being a professor. Actually, seriously, y'all. Honestly, women were able to go and to be professors, especially if they taught church history. Sometimes Bible would get dicey. But if you were a history professor, you can functionally do a whole lot of pastoral things. And it's okay, because you're not calling yourself a pastor. So those are 3. And then, of course, the most recent, relatively modern innovation is using the title of director. That's a big one. Even anything that does not require ordination is often what women are given titles for. And that enables churches to benefit from their labor without recognizing their actual callings. And again, it usually always comes with a significantly less paycheck, and you can see the report in the Southern Baptist Convention itself, in which 83% of women in official ministry positions in their churches were either volunteer status or part-time. Okay?
Hi. So I was just wondering, going back to especially the Old Testament, I guess, well, the New Testament too, but I remember thinking last year as I was studying through this for the very first time that I believe this was a spirit that said, this is not an exception. And I thought that was interesting. The Bible never calls it an exception whenever women do something in leadership. And so interestingly enough, in a women's roles discussion in the past couple of weeks at my church, it was said that anytime a woman is in leadership, it's an exception in the Bible. And I called that out and I said, no, I don't believe that's true. And so I don't really know how to argue that though. So I was just curious, or maybe not argue, but respond to that. So I was curious what you would say.
Oh, yeah. So this isn't Old Testament. I have all these biblical scholars in the room, so, I'll have to answer them afterwards. But one of the places that I always send people is just Romans 16, y'all. In almost any version, it's really hard to write away the leadership positions that we see there, because we see a woman called apostle, we see a woman called deacon, and we see women who we know are house church leaders. And so that's one easy way to counter. And plus, when you look at how many women are in that, 10, 11? 11? Okay, there you are. I had to look at Scott McKnight. But anyway, if you see how many women are in there, it's like, these are not exceptions. These are women everywhere who are doing this. So that's just a really easy way to go. It's also a good way to counter 1 Timothy 2, because you're like, and I have Sandra Glenn in the room. But anyway, if you're like, yes, Paul is telling some women are teaching in a way that they should not be teaching, but clearly that's not applying to all women because Paul is recognizing women as teachers. So that's a really good way to go. For the Old Testament, I recommend Will Gaffney's A Womanist Midrash. And one of the most brilliant things that she does in that is she teaches you how to see women in the Old Testament and to see beyond our translations that have written women out. And so she's a really great way, and she speaks in a very clear, very pastoral voice, and will walk you through that scholarship. Okay, we'll walk you through that. So those are things I recommend. Mm-hmm.
I appreciate your emphasis on the fact that there is a difference between what the academy knows, what the pastors know, either by ignorance or intentionality. And those of us who have studied such things know that, for example, there isn't such a thing as one overriding view of women throughout history.
Right.
But I'm curious, when you get pushback from people who say things like, how can you be going against, 2,000 years of church history, or so, like that kind of idea, and perhaps other ill-conceived ideas that they might have. How do you go about trying to respond in such a way that increases people's trust while also having to dismantle what they're saying?
So it depends on where the question is. If it's on social media, I usually don't respond because those are usually not good faith questions. Sometimes it depends, but anyway. If it's in person, like when I'm teaching a seminary class, which I had this happen in a seminary class, what I usually do is I lean on the Socratic method. I'm a big believer in the Socratic method in the classroom. It works really well. And so you turn the question back on them, like, why do you think that women have never been leaders through 2,000 years of history? Where did you get that information from? and usually they don't really have an idea of where they got that information from. But if you turn it back on to if you use questions, like to figure out where they are without challenging them, it forces them to think and start thinking, wait, maybe where I got this idea from isn't actually from the Bible, and yet I'm arguing that this is all biblical. I mean, that's, best case scenario. But nonetheless, asking questions isn't as challenging as you just simply saying you're wrong. Although sometimes I am tempted to say that, although never in the classroom. So I treat those questions like I would treat in the classroom, and then it is inquiry. And let's figure out where you got that from, because that's really fascinating. Sometimes I would say like, wow, that's so interesting. Tell me why you think that. So if you hear me say that to you, you know.
Hello there. I'm a U.S. history teacher and I teach
yay.
in high school. I teach at a private Christian school. And my question is, I'm still in my early years, so I myself am still learning history as I'm teaching to my students. And I should always be a student of history as I'm teaching. But early in colonial history, we have good examples of like a lot of male preachers relating to the history of evangelicalism. And then you also have Anne Hutchinson, but everyone's like, Anne Hutchinson preached and then she got exiled and died. Like
Right.
That's what everyone talks about. And so other than Anne Hutchinson, I don't have many practical examples of women in leadership roles in the church in early colonial American history, but then also in the First and Second Great Awakenings, because we have a lot of George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards. But
Absolutely.
Are there other examples of women like going on like circuit revivals and stuff? Because that would be great for me to include.
Totally.
So, practical question.
Catherine Breckus.
Okay.
Her book, Strangers and Pilgrims.
Okay.
She is at Harvard Divinity School, and she walks through, she has an appendix in the back that has something like 100, I don't remember how many, but she names women who are in the evidence of where they are and the preaching that they're going around and doing. Mm-hmm. So she would be a great place, I think, to start for that, just simply because she lists their names and you can look their names up there. Martha Stearns is another good name for you to know for another preaching. I actually just brought her name up because the pastors' wives often did plays in the 60s and 70s for their conference, and one of them was about Martha Stearns, which was actually really funny. And she actually talks about when her husband, she fills in for her husband preaching. And she actually did more than that. They were really functioned more as co-pastors, but nonetheless. But Catherine Breckus. There are a lot of examples of women preaching in early America. And so again, this is just a matter of knowing their names and knowing the history on where to find them. So Catherine Breckus is immediately who I would recommend. I actually wrote about her assessment of these women in The Making of Biblical Womanhood. So I have that in there. Mm-hmm.
Okay,
yeah.
fantastic,
so
thank you.
A little bit helpful, yeah. But that's great, and thank you for, my rule of thumb that I often tell history teachers is every time you talk about a man, talk about a woman. And so, biblical parallelism, just like Luke. Yeah. So, yeah.
I also teach AP US History, and it's amazing even in a curriculum that comes from a place that a lot of, especially sometimes conservative Christians, talk about AP as very on the left or something. Even in that curriculum, there's like limited required understanding of any women's history, so it's quite interesting.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I really appreciated your description of the abbess and how not only was she preaching and teaching, she was also governing and maybe the sole head governor. When we take women away from the ordained pastor role, we're also taking them away from the adjudication table when misconduct, specifically clergy sexual abuse, comes up. I've noticed a pattern, we probably all know it, in the last, say 5 years. We have the SBC, we have the guidepost investigation, followed by the subsequent lockdown and messenger vote to kick out churches that ordain women. We've seen that in the PCA, we've seen that in the ACNA, huge abuse crisis. Now bishops saying, we're gonna leave over women's ordination. I'd love to hear you comment on that.
Yeah, well, absolutely, they're connected. When you manage to convince your denomination that women biblically aren't in leadership roles, thank you, ESV, that women historically aren't in leadership roles, then you are able to discount women's voices in your church. And, you know, it literally becomes an all-boys club at the top, and women trying, you know, I'm looking at Scott McKnight and his daughter Laura Berenger have written some great books about, you know, a church called Tove. I highly recommend, as well as the follow-up to it, which actually talks about this. But if you put, you know, all men at the table, they are much more likely to listen to each other's voices than to listen to the voices of women, as well as to protect each other. And in fact, I talk about this in the 8th chapter, Becoming the Pastor's Wife, a really clear example of this, where men are more likely to forgive other men than they are to protect women in some of these cases. Not all men, but in some of these cases, yeah.
We'll take 2 more questions. Eric.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I'm a master's student, regretfully not very well versed in medieval studies. And so I think I experienced a bit of anger when I noticed, when you showed that there are some outright lies that are published authoritatively, knowing that if I were doing a research paper on the 7th century, I would not know.
Right.
I'd probably avoid a book edited by Grudem, but other than that foresight, I would not know how to identify that. Can you, especially for the students, but also for those church members, like you said, church members needing to study church history, can you share some advice on how we can spot or avoid or be critical of that kind of misinformation?
Well, one of the things you can do is you can go to their footnotes. Do they have footnotes? And are their footnotes citing reputable historical sources or primary source evidence, or are they just citing like newspaper articles? Or not to diminish journalism, but it's nonetheless, what are they citing? What are they citing? Who are they citing? Are they citing people who are publishing attached to the academy in some sort of way or some sort of official scholarship who have credentials to be teaching this stuff? And so sometimes just going back and looking to see, I know that's another step. I know that. But that's how, I mean, we're in a world where we have to fact check everything, including our textbooks. And so that would be the thing is, you know, where did they get that information from? And if you can't find where they got that information done, don't use it. That's a great rule of thumb. If you can't find where they got it from, don't use it, okay? And, you know, it may be that maybe their publisher made them take out all of the notes. I mean, that's very, you know, somebody who, you know, I think Brazos gave up with this book on how many footnotes I had in it. But still, for your initial thing, I would just avoid it. And so use sources that you can check their sources. And that would be that would help a lot. So, yeah.
Thank you.
One last question. Yes, go ahead.
Mine isn't really a question. It's just wanted to say thank you. About 12 years ago, I did my pastoral internship, and then I became the first female pastor when I was in Okinawa, Japan, of a little church there. When I came back to the United States, my husband was military, so I took a job pretty much anywhere I could get it. I was not even allowed to be named as the ministry leader of my ministry in an SBC church. My husband, who was in Afghanistan fighting in a war, was named as the head of the ministry. 2 years after I left there, they had changed the rules and said that women could be ministry leaders. 8 years later, we moved on. I came back to that church, and I was the first female pastor at that SBC church. 2 years later, the SBC decided to start this investigative work, and in 2021, I saw the writing on the wall. When I decided to leave that church before I was told to leave, we had a female music pastor, female children's pastor. I was the associate pastor, right underneath the senior pastor. There are no women in any level of ministry at that church, in pastoral ministry any longer. But my parting gift to every single person and every single elder was your book. I bought 15 copies. Thank you very, very much.
That's amazing. Thank you for that. And thank you for your ministry. Women always minister, even when people try to stop us. So thank you.
Thank you. As we come to the close, I would like to close with a prayer. It's the evening prayer. Perhaps you know it by heart from the Book of Common Prayer. But before that, I am reminded, as Dr. Barr was speaking to us about history, of Rowan Williams's axiom in Why Study History. Good history, he says, is irreducibly a moral affair. Thank you so much. Would you pray with me? O gracious light, pure brightness of the ever-living Father in heaven. O Jesus Christ, holy and blessed. Now, as we come to the setting of the sun and our eyes behold the vesper light, we sing your praises, O God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. You are worthy at all times to be praised by happy voices, O Son of God, O Giver of life, and to be glorified through all the worlds. Amen. Go in peace, and we hope to see you tomorrow morning.